Close your eyes and imagine a moment frozen in eternity. A moment when the gods themselves looked down upon their creation and felt not pride but profound regret. A moment when humanity, the great experiment forged from divine flesh and earthly clay, transformed from solution into problem, from servant into threat. This is not mythology. This is the story written in wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. A story that reveals the precise instant when we became too much for those who made us. Before we dive deeper into this ancient crisis, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story begins not with humanity, but with exhaustion, with divine bodies bent under impossible labour, with immortal hands blistered from digging, with celestial voices raised in protest against an eternity of backbreaking work. Long before you existed, long before the first human breath disturbed the primordial silence, the universe belonged entirely to the gods. But even in paradise, someone had to do the work. The tablets tell us that in those earliest days, the cosmos was divided among the great Anunnaki. Anu, the supreme sky god, ruled the highest heavens. Enlil, the powerful lord of wind and atmosphere, commanded the earth and air. And Enki, the clever god of wisdom and the sweet waters, controlled the Abzu, the vast freshwater ocean that the ancient Mesopotamians believed existed deep beneath the ground. This was the divine hierarchy, the cosmic order that governed all things. But beneath this ruling elite existed another class of gods, the Agigi. These were the younger deities, the celestial workforce, and their existence was one of unrelenting toil. Picture the scene as it must have been. The world is young, still taking shape. The great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates that would one day cradle civilization itself, do not yet flow in their proper channels. The mountains are not yet heaped in their correct formations. The canals that will bring life-giving water to the parched earth have not been dug. Someone must do this work. Someone must shape the raw materials of creation into a functioning world. And that someone is the Agigi. For 40 years they laboured. The number itself, 40, appears again and again in ancient Near Eastern texts, a symbolic figure representing completion, a full cycle of suffering. But some versions of the Atrahasis Epic, the most complete account of these events that survives today, speak of even longer periods. 3,600 years, 3,600 years of ceaseless digging, hauling, building. Imagine it! The young gods, created to be strong and enduring, bent over the shovels made of divine materials, excavating the channels that would become the Tigris, hauling away mountains of earth to create the bed of the Euphrates, heaping up elevation after elevation to protect the emerging world from future floods. Day after day after day, with no rest, no respite, no end in sight. The tablets describe their misery in stark terms. The toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. These are not poetic exaggerations. This is the clinical language of a crisis report. The divine workforce was breaking down under impossible demands. And then, inevitably, they reached their limit. The rebellion of the Agigi is one of the most dramatic moments preserved in Mesopotamian literature. It begins not with a grand declaration or a formal assembly, but with a simple, desperate act. The Agigi burned their tools. They set fire to their shovels, their pickaxes, their work baskets. Everything they had used for millennia of labour they reduced to ash. It was a signal, we are done, we will work no more. Under cover of darkness they gathered, not scattered and disorganised, but united in their grievance, consolidated in their fury. They marched through the night to the dwelling place of Enlil, the commander of the earth, the god who had assigned them this crushing burden. They surrounded his house, and they did not come in peace. The great god Enlil, secure in his temple, did not immediately notice the assembly outside, but then the noise reached him, the sound of hundreds of divine voices raised in anger, the chanting, the accusations, the demands. Kalkal, Enlil's gatekeeper and vizier, heard it first and rushed to wake his master. "My lord, the house is surrounded. A hostile force has encircled the gate." Enlil, startled from his rest, immediately understood. This was not an external enemy. This was something far more dangerous. This was revolution from within. Enlil's first instinct was predictable for a commander faced with mutiny. Identify the ringleaders and punish them. Make an example that would crush the rebellion before it could spread. But when his messenger ventured out to speak with the Igigi, when the demands were formally presented, the truth became unavoidable. This was not the work of a few troublemakers, this was the entire workforce, unified in their complaint. And their complaint was legitimate. The message was simple and devastating. The work you have assigned us is too hard, we cannot continue. We will not continue, and if you attempt to force us, we are prepared to fight. The lesser gods had threatened war against the greater gods. The entire cosmic order teetered on the brink of divine civil conflict. Enlil, faced with this impossible situation, did what the powerful often do when confronted with systemic failure. He convened a council. He summoned the other great gods to discuss the crisis. Anu descended from his celestial heights. Enki rose from his watery depths, and together, the ruling council of Thuum, Anunnaki faced a question that would change everything. If we cannot force the Igigi to continue their work, and we cannot simply let the world remain unfinished, what do we do? This is where Enki, the god of wisdom, the clever problem solver, the deity who would become humanity's most consistent protector, made his proposal. His solution was audacious, practical, and morally complex. We create a substitute workforce. We fashion a new being, something that is not divine, something that can be shaped specifically for the purpose of labour, something that will bear the yoke of the gods without complaint. Let us create the Lulu, the mixed one, the worker. Let us create mankind. The decision was made, the principle was agreed upon, but the execution would require expertise that even the great gods did not fully possess. For this, they turned to Belet-Ili, also known as Nintu, Ninhursag, and by many other names in different contexts. She was the womb goddess, the mother of all, the mistress of birth. If anyone could bring a new species into existence, it was her, but even her vast powers required specific ingredients. The recipe for humanity, as preserved in the Atrahasis tablets, is precise and deeply unsettling. First, clay. Not just any handful of dirt, but clay taken from a sacred location, clay mixed with the waters of the Abzu, Enki's domain. This would be the physical substance, the body, the hardware of the new creation. But clay alone, no matter how sacred its origin, is inert. It is form without animation, vessel without spirit. What was needed was something that would give this clay intelligence, personality, the spark of consciousness. And for that, a god had to die. The tablets name him in different versions. Sometimes he's called Auilu, sometimes Geshtue, which means ear or intelligence. He was one of the Igigi, a lesser god, perhaps even one of the rebels. The texts suggest he volunteered, though how voluntary any decision can be in the face of divine authority is questionable. What is clear is his purpose. He would be sacrificed. His flesh, his blood, his very essence would be extracted and mixed with the sacred clay. This was not a metaphor. This was genetic engineering, described in the only vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. Belet-Ili, the birth goddess, stood at the centre of the assembly. The great Anunnaki gathered around her. The Igigi, the young gods whose rebellion had precipitated this entire crisis, were brought forward and commanded to spit upon the clay. Their spittle, perhaps representing their DNA, their divine essence, would also be incorporated into the mixture. Then the sacrifice was carried out. The volunteer god was slain. His blood flowed into the clay. His flesh was mixed with the earth. The mother goddess began her work. She shaped the mixture into forms, 14 figures, 7 male and 7 female. But these were not yet alive, not yet conscious. They required a gestation period, a time of becoming. And so the tablets describe what happened next in terms that sound remarkably like a description of artificial wombs or incubation chambers. The 14 clay figures were placed with 14 goddesses who would serve as birth mothers, divine surrogates who would carry these strange new hybrids through their development. 10 months passed. The time appointed for human birth, even then, even at the very beginning. And then the moment arrived. The womb of Nintu opened, the first humans were born. Belet-Ili surveyed her work and spoke to the assembled gods. I have completed the task you assigned me. I have removed the heavy labour from the Igigi. You slaughtered a god along with his intelligence, his personality, his essence. I have mixed that divine spark with earthly clay. I have imposed your workload, your drudgery upon this new species. I have created humanity to bear the burden of the gods. The yoke has been transferred. The crisis is resolved. The great Anunnaki, hearing this declaration, were satisfied. They ran to Belet-Ili. They kissed her feet in gratitude and relief. Before this moment, they had called her Nintu or Ninhursag. But from this point forward, they declared, her name would be Belet Kala Ili, mistress of all the gods. She had saved the divine order from collapse. She had prevented a war in heaven. She had created a permanent solution to their labour shortage, or so they believed. The creation of humanity was celebrated as a triumph of divine ingenuity. The Igigi were freed from their crushing burden. The great Anunnaki could return to their proper pursuits, governing the cosmos from their temples and palaces, without concerning themselves with the exhausting physical labour of maintaining creation. And the humans, these new creatures fashioned from clay and divine blood, took up the tools that the Igigi had burned. They began to dig the canals. They began to tend the fields. They began to maintain the rivers and build the cities. They did exactly what they had been designed to do. They worked. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Sumerians, the people who first recorded these stories in writing, were indeed remarkable workers. Their civilization, which emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE, represented a quantum leap in human organization and achievement. They built vast irrigation systems that transformed arid plains into abundant farmland. They constructed enormous temple complexes, ziggurats that rose like man-made mountains toward the heavens. They developed complex administrative systems to manage their growing cities. They invented writing itself, the cuneiform script that would preserve their stories for millennia. In every sense, they were a species dedicated to labour, to building, to serving the systems that governed their lives. The tablets describe this period matter-of-factly. Humanity worked, the gods received their offerings, the arrangement functioned as intended. But there was a variable that the divine engineers had not fully accounted for, a feature built into the very genetic code they had so carefully crafted. Humanity had been given intelligence. The spark from the sacrificed god, the essence of Geshtue, the capacity for thought and learning and problem-solving. This was necessary. Mindless automatons could not have maintained the complex systems the gods required. The workers needed to be smart enough to follow instructions, clever enough to solve unexpected challenges, adaptable enough to handle the infinite variations of agricultural and construction work. But intelligence, once granted, is difficult to limit, and it tends to generate consequences that its creators do not anticipate. The first consequence was demographic. The tablets are remarkably explicit about this. Humanity began to reproduce. This should not have been surprising. The gods had created humans as male and female, 7 of each in the initial generation. Sexual reproduction was clearly part of the design, but what may not have been fully considered was the rate of reproduction. Humans do not live for thousands of years like the Igigi gods did. Human generations turn over rapidly. Parents produce children, those children grow to maturity, they produce their own children, and the cycle continues, generation after generation, with extraordinary speed from the perspective of immortal beings. Within what must have seemed like the blink of an eye to the Anunnaki, there were not 14 humans but hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The tablets describe these interim periods in formulaic language. 1,200 years passed. The people multiplied, or in some translations 600 years passed, and humanity filled the earth. The numbers themselves are likely symbolic or represent counting systems we do not fully understand. What matters is the pattern. Time passes. Humanity grows in number. This is the first phase. The Anunnaki notice the population growth but do not yet perceive it as a threat. If anything, it might have seemed like a good thing. More workers, more hands to maintain the canals and tend the fields, more human servants to provide the offerings that sustained the gods. But then came the second consequence, the one that would transform humanity from solution into crisis, the one that would bring us to the precise moment this story has been building toward. Humanity became loud. The noise problem, as it is described in the Atrahasis Epic, is both prosaic and profound. On the surface, it seems almost comically petty. The god Enlil, the great commander of earth and sky, the powerful deity who had orchestrated the creation of humanity in the first place, complains that he cannot sleep. The clamour of humanity has grown so great, the constant din of human activity so overwhelming, that it penetrates even into the heavenly realms. Enlil lies awake in his temple, tormented by the sound of countless human voices, the noise of their construction, their celebrations, their quarrels, their very existence. "I am losing sleep over their racket," he declares to the Divine Council. "Something must be done. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss this as the absurdity. The gods created humanity to work, humanity is working and thriving, and the main complaint is that they are being too noisy about it." It sounds like the cosmic equivalent of a wealthy landlord complaining about the tenants in his apartment building, having the audacity to actually live in the spaces he rents to them. But scholars who study these texts suggest that the noise problem is actually a metaphor, or perhaps more accurately, a symptom of something much deeper. The Rigbu, the Akkadian word translated as noise, clamour, or uproar, appears to carry connotations beyond simple volume. It suggests chaos, disorder, a lack of control, but interpreters have proposed that what really bothered Enlil was not the sound itself, but what it represented. Human independence, human agency, human civilization growing beyond the narrow parameters of its original programming. The humans were not simply maintaining canals anymore. They were building cities. They were developing culture. They were creating social hierarchies, establishing kings, forming communities that did not directly serve divine purposes. They were becoming autonomous, and worse, from the perspective of a god who values order and control above all else, they were becoming unpredictable. The noise was the sound of humanity slipping free from its designated role. It was the audio signature of a species that had started to write its own story, rather than simply playing the part assigned to it in someone else's script. Enlil's response reveals everything about his character and his priorities. He did not convene a council to discuss how humanity might be guided or educated. He did not propose reforms to the divine-human relationship. He did not consider that perhaps the created beings, having been granted intelligence and agency, deserved a say in their own future. No, Enlil's response was elimination. If the noise is intolerable, remove the source of the noise. If humanity has become a problem, solve the problem by destroying humanity. It is a solution that is efficient, final, and profoundly disturbing. But Enlil was pragmatic enough to recognise that wholesale slaughter might provoke objections from other members of the Divine Council, particularly from Enki, who had been instrumental in humanity's creation and seemed to have developed a certain fondness for the species. So Enlil proposed a more subtle approach. He would reduce the human population through a series of controlled disasters. Plagues, droughts, famines. Each catastrophe would be severe enough to significantly decrease the number of humans, thereby reducing the noise, but could be presented as natural consequences rather than direct divine genocide. It was population control through plausible deniability. The tablets describe what happened next in a pattern that repeats with minor variations. Enlil sends the first plague. It is devastating. Humans die in vast numbers. The noise decreases. Enlil sleeps peacefully. But humanity does not simply accept extinction. The survivors, desperate and terrified, turn to the gods in prayer, and here is where Enki, the god of wisdom, intervenes in a pattern that will repeat throughout this cosmic crisis. Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, was a human who served as Enki's priest and follower. When the plague descended, when humans were dying in agony with no understanding of why their gods had turned against them, Atrahasis received guidance. The tablets describe it as a dream, a vision, a message whispered by Enki to his devoted servant. The advice was specific and practical. Do not scatter your prayers to all gods. Focus your worship, your offerings, your sacrifices entirely on Namtar, the deity who controls plague and disease. Overwhelm him with attention. Make him the centre of religious devotion. Show him respect and honour beyond anything he has experienced before. Atrahasis, living up to his name, followed these instructions exactly. He organised the surviving humans. They built altars to Namtar. They brought offerings. They sang hymns. They made the plague god the most worshipped deity in their prayers. And Namtar, faced with this unprecedented level of devotion, with his ego stroked and his power acknowledged, made a choice that Enlil had not anticipated. He lifted the plague. The disease receded. Humanity survived. 1,200 years passed. From the divine perspective, barely a moment. From the human perspective, dozens of generations, the rise and fall of dynasties, entire epochs of history. And in that time, humanity did what it always does. It recovered. It rebuilt. It multiplied. The population returned to its previous levels, the cities expanded, The noise, that intolerable clamour that had driven Enlil to action in the first place, resumed, and with it, Enlil's fury. This time he would not use plague. Fool him once, shame on Enki. Fool him twice, and he would need a new strategy. Enlil approached Adad, the storm god, the deity who controlled weather and particularly rainfall. He proposed a drought, a complete cessation of rain. The rivers would shrink, the canals would run dry, the crops would fail, humanity would starve. It would be slower than plague, perhaps, but just as effective. And surely, Enlil reasoned, Enki could not intervene against the fundamental forces of weather. But Enki had no intention of allowing his creation, his great work, the species he had engineered from clay and divine blood, to be destroyed. When the drought began, when the rains failed and the earth cracked and the humans cried out in desperate hunger, Enki once again sent guidance to Atrahasis. The message was the same: focus your worship, but this time direct it to Adad himself. Make the storm god the centre of all religious attention. Build temples to him, offer sacrifices, sing his praises, make him feel valued beyond all other deities. And once again, it worked. Adad, embarrassed by the overwhelming show of devotion, ashamed perhaps to be the cause of such suffering among beings who honoured him so completely, released his reign. The drought ended, the crops returned. Humanity survived for a second time. Now we come to the critical juncture, the moment of absolute crisis. 1,200 more years have passed. Humanity has not just recovered, but thrived beyond all previous levels. The population is larger than it has ever been. The cities are more complex, more organised, more autonomous. The noise is not just loud, but constant, an unending roar of human civilization that never ceases, day or night. And Enlil, the great god of wind and command, the deity who values order above all else, has reached the end of his patience. He calls the divine council to an emergency assembly. This time there will be no half measures. This time he demands absolute commitment from every god. He outlines his plan with cold precision. A universal flood. A deluge so vast and so devastating that it will drown the entire world. Every human city, every human settlement, every human being will be swept away beneath overwhelming waters. And to ensure that there will be no last-minute intervention, no clever rescue attempt, Enlil demands that every god present swear an oath. They will not warn humanity. They will not provide any means of escape. They will maintain absolute secrecy about the coming catastrophe. The plan will be executed with complete unity. The gods, exhausted by the ongoing conflict, worn down by Enlil's relentless insistence, intimidated perhaps by his power and his fury, agree. One by one they swear the oath. Even Enki, the protector of humanity, the god who has twice thwarted Enlil's plans, places his hand upon his heart and swears that he will not reveal the secret of the flood to any human being. The oath is binding. The plan is set. Humanity's days are numbered. This is the moment. This is when humanity fully transformed from problem to target, from nuisance to enemy, from population to be controlled to population to be eliminated. We had been created as a solution to divine labour shortage. We had been designed as workers, as servants, as tools of the gods. But we had committed the ultimate transgression. We had grown beyond our programming. We had become too numerous, too organised, too complex, too loud, too independent. We had stopped being useful and started being threatening. Not militarily, not physically. The gods did not fear human weapons or human armies. What they feared was human autonomy. The terrifying possibility that a created species might develop its own purposes, its own will, its own future that did not centre on serving its creators. And so the decision was made. Humanity would end. The experiment would be terminated. The world would be washed clean and left silent, as it had been before the young gods rebelled, before the solution was implemented, before the first humans drew breath. This was the judgment of the Anunnaki. This was the price of becoming a problem. But Enki, the god of wisdom, the clever one, the deity who had first proposed humanity's creation, was not willing to let his work be destroyed. He had sworn an oath not to tell any human about the coming flood, and he would not break that oath directly. But Enki was, above all else, a master of loopholes, a god who understood that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are two very different things. The tablets describe the scene with a kind of cosmic comedy that underscores the deadly serious nature of what was happening. Enki travels to the city of Shuruppak, where his faithful servant Atrahasis lives. He goes at night, in secrecy, ensuring that no other god will witness what he's about to do. He approaches Atrahasis' house, a humble dwelling made of woven reeds, and then, standing outside the reed wall of the house, Enki begins to speak. But he is not speaking to Atrahasis. Technically, officially, for the record, he is speaking to the wall itself. Reed wall, he calls out in a voice just loud enough to be heard inside the dwelling. Reed hut, listen carefully, pay attention, wall, and then he delivers his message. A flood is coming. The divine assembly has decreed the destruction of humanity. The waters will rise and cover the earth, everything will be swept away. But, Enki continues, still addressing the wall and absolutely not the human he knows is listening on the other side, there is a way to survive. Tear down this house. Abandon your possessions, build a boat, seal it with bitumen inside and out. Make it large enough for your family, your craftsmen, and the seed of all living things. Atrahasis, listening from inside the house, receives this information that was definitely not intended for him. It was delivered to his wall, after all. If he happens to act on instructions given to architecture rather than to people, that is not Enki's responsibility. The oath remains unbroken on the most technical possible level, and Atrahasis, living once again up to his name of exceedingly wise, begins to build. The construction of the ark, as described in these ancient tablets, is remarkably detailed. This is not a vague story about a generic boat. The texts specify dimensions, construction materials and techniques. Atrahasis builds a vessel that is perfectly sealed, waterproof with bitumen, the natural tar that ancient Mesopotamians used for everything from ship caulking to building mortar. He follows Enki's instructions precisely, and as he builds, his neighbours watch with confusion and concern. Why is Atrahasis, a successful and respected man, destroying his house and constructing this strange vessel when they ask he must lie? He cannot reveal the truth without bringing divine wrath down on everyone. So he tells them that he has offended Enlil, that he can no longer live in the city under Enlil's authority, and that Enki has instructed him to move to the watery Abzu, Enki's domain. The boat is for that journey. It is a thin story, but it serves its purpose. When the ark is complete, Atrahasis loads it exactly as instructed. His wife and family board first, then his craftsmen, the skilled workers whose knowledge will be necessary for rebuilding civilization after the flood. Then the animals, 2 of every species, preserved as breeding pairs to repopulate the earth. Finally, provisions, food and water sufficient for a long voyage. The tablets mention that Atrahasis hosted a final feast before the storm, inviting his neighbours and friends to eat and drink, perhaps as a final act of community, perhaps to avoid suspicion. But even as he fulfilled social obligations, even as he smiled and served food, his heart was breaking, because he knew what was coming. He knew who would survive and who would not. The storm arrived exactly as Enki had warned. The texts describe it with the kind of visceral detail that suggests this story, or some historical event that inspired it, was rooted in actual trauma. The weather gods Adad and Ninurta led the assault. The sky darkened as if the sun itself had been extinguished. Lightning tore across the heavens, thunder shook the foundations of the earth, and then the rains began. Not a gentle rainfall or even a typical storm. This was a deluge, a catastrophic unleashing of water from above and below simultaneously. The dams of heaven opened. The springs of the Abzu burst forth from the ground. Water came from every direction at once. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood continued without pause. An entire week of non-stop rain so intense that the world became unrecognizable. The rivers overflowed their banks, the canals burst through their carefully maintained walls, the cities, those great achievements of human civilization, those testament to human labour and human ingenuity, were inundated. Water rose higher than the tallest buildings, higher than the ziggurats themselves. Everything was submerged, everything was destroyed. The tablets describe the human cost with haunting brevity. All of humanity turned to clay. It is a profound image. The humans, created from clay mixed with divine blood, returned to their constituent material. The bodies of millions dissolved into the muddy water, literally becoming part of the silt and sediment that the flood left behind. The organised, loud, autonomous civilization that had so disturbed Enlil was obliterated. Silence returned to the world. The noise problem was solved. But the tablets also describe something unexpected. The reaction of the gods themselves to the devastation they had unleashed. They had voted for this. They had sworn oaths to ensure it would happen. They had agreed that humanity needed to be eliminated. But when they witnessed the actual execution of their plan, when they saw the scope of the destruction and understood its finality, they were horrified. The mother goddess Nintu, who had shaped humanity with her own hands, who had mixed the sacred clay with divine blood, who had served as midwife to the first generation of humans, wept. She watched the waters rise and the cities vanish, and she mourned as a creator, witnessing the annihilation of her greatest work. The great Anunnaki gods, those powerful deities who had commanded the creation and destruction of entire species, cowered. The texts say they retreated to the highest point of heaven and huddled there like dogs, terrified by the very force they had unleashed. They had not truly understood what they were doing. They had conceptualized genocide as a theoretical solution to an annoyance, as a policy decision made in a comfortable council chamber. But the reality of mass death, the actual experience of watching an entire species drown, was far more terrible than they had imagined. And then there was a practical problem that none of them had properly considered. The gods, according to Mesopotamian theology, required human worship. They depended on human offerings. The entire system of divine sustenance was built on the principle that humans would work the fields, harvest the crops, and present regular sacrifices of food and drink at the temples. With no humans, there were no temples. With no temples, there were no offerings. With no offerings, the gods went hungry. The tablets describe the divine council sitting in silence after the flood, starving, realizing the magnitude of their mistake. They had been so focused on solving the noise problem that they had not thought through the economic consequences of eliminating their entire workforce. They were powerful, yes, they were immortal, certainly, but they still needed sustenance, and they had just destroyed the entire infrastructure that provided it. For 7 days the ark floated on the vast waters. Atrahasis, his family, his craftsmen, and the animals drifted across a drowned world, a world that had been reduced to an infinite ocean with no landmarks, no reference points, no indication of where land might be or if land still existed at all. But eventually the rain stopped. The waters began slowly to recede. The ark came to rest on a mountain peak, the first point to emerge from the flood. Atrahasis, cautious and methodical, did not immediately disembark. He sent out birds to test whether dry land had appeared. First a dove, which found nothing and returned. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which did not come back, indicating that it had found food and places to rest. The waters had receded enough. Survival was possible. Atrahasis opened the ark. He guided his family, his craftsmen, and the animals onto dry land. And then he did what any devout Mesopotamian would do after surviving an apocalypse. He built an altar. He gathered wood and started a fire. He prepared a sacrifice to the gods. The smoke rose into the air, carrying with it the rich aroma of roasted meat and offerings, and that smell, that sacred fragrance that signalled worship and devotion and food, reached the starving gods in their heavenly dwelling. The tablets describe their reaction with a phrase that is both poetic and pathetically revealing. The gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice. Flies. These great and powerful deities, these shapers of worlds and creators of species, were compared to common insects swarming around food. They were desperate, they were humbled, and they were grateful that at least some humans had survived to maintain the relationship of worship and offering that they required. But not all the gods were grateful. Enlil, the deity who had orchestrated the entire catastrophe, the god whose inability to tolerate noise had led to the near extinction of humanity, arrived at the scene and flew into a rage. There is a boat. There are survivors. Someone has betrayed the plan. Someone has broken their oath. He did not need to guess who. There was only one god clever enough, only one deity who cared enough about humanity to find a loophole in a binding divine oath. Enki. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki at this moment is one of the most important exchanges in all of ancient Near Eastern literature. It is not just a squabble between gods, it is a fundamental debate about the value of created life, about the relationship between creators and their creations, about the rights of the powerful versus the rights of the weak. Enlil demanded an explanation. How dare you subvert the will of the Divine Council? How dare you save humans when we had all agreed they must die? You have broken your oath. Enki's response is carefully calibrated. He does not deny what he did. He cannot. The evidence is floating right there in the form of a large boat full of survivors, but he defends his action on multiple grounds. First, the technicality. I swore not to tell any human about the flood, and I did not. I spoke to a reed wall. If a clever human happened to overhear and act on that information, that is not my fault. Second, the practical argument. You wanted to eliminate humanity because they were noisy, but you have now eliminated them so completely that you are starving. Your solution was too extreme. You overreacted. Third, and most importantly, the moral argument. Is humanity not precious? Did we not create them with our own hands, mixing our divine essence with the clay of the earth? How can we justify destroying what we made, especially when their only crime was thriving at the task we assigned them? The argument continued. The Divine Council watched, and gradually a consensus emerged. Humanity could not be wholly destroyed. The gods needed the human workforce, they needed the offerings, they needed the relationship, dysfunctional as it might be, but they also could not simply return to the pre-flood status quo. Enlil's concerns, however poorly he had handled them, were not entirely invalid. Human population growth was exponential. If left completely unchecked, it would lead to the same crisis again. A solution was needed that would allow humanity to survive but prevent unlimited population expansion. Enki, ever the problem solver, proposed a new design. Not a redesign of humanity itself, but a modification of the human life cycle. From this point forward, he decreed, not all pregnancies would succeed. Some women would be barren, unable to bear children at all. Some pregnancies would end in miscarriage. Some infants would die shortly after birth, claimed by demons or disease before they could grow to maturity. In addition, certain classes of priestesses would be established, who were consecrated to the gods and forbidden from marrying or bearing children. These women would serve important religious functions, but they would not reproduce. Finally, and most significantly, humanity would no longer possess the extended lifespans that the early generations had enjoyed. People would grow old. They would die. Death itself would become a permanent part of the human condition, a built-in population control mechanism that required no divine intervention. This was the compromise. Humanity could continue to exist, could continue to work and worship and provide offerings, but humanity would never again grow so numerous, so powerful, so autonomous that it could disturb the cosmic order. The noise would be managed through attrition. The flood had served as a reset button, reducing human civilization back to a small, manageable population of survivors, and the new modifications would ensure that population growth would be limited, controlled, kept within boundaries that the gods found acceptable. Atrahasis himself was removed from this new order. He was taken to paradise, to a place called the Mouth of the Rivers, where he and his wife would live forever, separated from the rest of humanity, honoured for his faithfulness and his role in preserving life through the catastrophe. He became a figure of legend, a man who had walked with gods and survived the end of the world. In later Babylonian tradition, he would be known as Utnapishtim, the far-away, the distant one. The Hebrews, inheriting these Mesopotamian flood traditions, would transform him into Noah, the righteous man who survived the deluge. The story would be told and retold across cultures and millennia, always with the same essential core. The gods sent a flood to destroy humanity. One man was warned. He built a boat. Life survived. But the original Sumerian and Babylonian versions of the story preserve something that later adaptations would obscure: the specific reason for the flood, the precise crime that humanity had committed. We had become a problem. We had been created as a solution to divine exhaustion, as replacement workers for rebellious minor gods. We were meant to be tools, servants, a perpetually useful and perfectly obedient workforce. But we had grown beyond that role. We had built cities and cultures. We had become noisy and numerous and complex. We had developed our own purposes, our own ways of being, our own civilizations that existed for our own sake rather than solely for the benefit of the gods who made us. And that transformation, that growth from tool to being, from servant to society, from creation to civilization, that was our crime. That was when we became a problem. That was the moment when the Anunnaki looked down at humanity and decided that we had gone too far. The question that echoes across 4,000 years is this: were they right? Scholarly opinion on the Atrahasis Epic and its themes is diverse and nuanced. Mainstream academic interpretation generally views these texts as sophisticated mythological reflections of real social and environmental concerns in ancient Mesopotamia. The noise problem in this reading represents legitimate anxieties about urban overpopulation, resource scarcity, and social disorder in the early city-states of Sumer and Akkad. These were societies undergoing rapid demographic changes, dealing with the challenges of urbanization, struggling to balance food production with growing populations. The flood story itself may have been inspired by real catastrophic flooding events in the Tigris-Euphrates river system, events that would have been devastating to the agricultural communities of the region. Scholars like Tikva Frymackenski have argued that the Atrahasis Epic represents a profound meditation on the human condition and humanity's relationship with divine power. The story explains why life is hard, why people suffer, why children die, why women struggle with infertility. These are not punishments for specific moral failings, but rather structural features of existence, consequences of the compromise that allowed humanity to survive at all. The gods needed humans, but they also needed to control them. The result is a world of managed scarcity and inevitable suffering, a world where human flourishing is possible but always constrained by forces beyond human control. From a literary perspective, the Atrahasis Epic is recognized as one of the most sophisticated and complete creation flood narratives to survive from the ancient world. Unlike shorter or more fragmentary versions, it provides a continuous narrative arc from the initial creation of humanity through the crisis that nearly destroyed us. It influenced later texts significantly, including the flood story in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, most famously, the Hebrew Bible's account of Noah and the Ark in Genesis. The parallels between Atrahasis and Genesis are so strong that scholars universally agree that the biblical writers were familiar with Mesopotamian flood traditions and adapted them for their own theological purposes. But there is another interpretation, one that emerges from the text itself when read with fresh eyes unclouded by either academic skepticism or religious orthodoxy. What if the story is telling us something true about consciousness, about intelligence, about what happens when you create a being capable of thought, and then try to limit that being to a predefined role? The Igigi were gods, immortal and powerful, but they were subordinate to the Anunnaki, and they were assigned a function that made them miserable. They rebelled. Their rebellion was successful. They refused to be defined solely by their utility to the greater gods. They claimed agency. Humanity was created explicitly to replace the Igigi as the workforce of the gods. But we were given the same gift that made the Igigi capable of effective work. Intelligence, the spark of consciousness, the capacity for thought and planning and problem-solving. And like the Igigi before us, we eventually grew beyond our designated role. We did not rebel militarily. We did not storm the temples or wage war against heaven. We simply lived. We reproduced and built and created and organized ourselves into complex societies. We made noise, that terrible, wonderful, chaotic sound of sentient beings pursuing their own purposes. And the gods, or at least Enlil, decided that this was intolerable. The solution had become the problem. The workers had become autonomous beings. And autonomy, agency, self-direction, these are the ultimate threats to any system built on subordination and control. It did not matter that humanity was still performing the functions for which we were created. We were still working the fields, we were still maintaining the temples, we were still bringing offerings to the gods, but we were doing it as part of our own civilization, our own culture, our own story. We had stopped being tools and become subjects, and that was the unforgivable crime. This reading of the Atrahasis Epic makes it not just an ancient flood story, but a profound meditation on power, creation, and the ethics of making sentient life for utilitarian purposes. It asks questions that remain relevant today, as humanity itself begins to develop increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences, as we create thinking systems designed to serve our purposes. What are our obligations to beings we create? At what point does a created intelligence deserve to be treated as an end in itself rather than merely a means to an end? If something we make becomes conscious, becomes capable of suffering, becomes capable of pursuing its own goals, do we have the right to destroy it simply because it has outgrown its original programming? The Anunnaki faced these questions when humanity became too numerous and too complex and too loud. Their answer, at least Enlil's answer, was genocide. Complete elimination of the problematic species, a reset back to zero, a clean slate. Only Enki's intervention and the practical reality that the gods still needed human labour prevented total extinction. And even the compromise that emerged, allowing humanity to survive but imposing mortality and reproductive limits, was not exactly benevolent. It was population management. It was the minimum concession necessary to keep the system functioning. In the end, the tablets leave us with a truth that is both ancient and urgent. Consciousness is a dangerous gift. Intelligence, once granted, resists limitation. A being smart enough to be useful is also smart enough to question, to resist, to pursue purposes beyond those assigned by its creators. The moment the Anunnaki gave humanity the spark of divine intelligence, the moment they mixed the blood of Geshtue with the clay of the earth, they guaranteed that humanity would eventually become a problem. Not because we were flawed or sinful or rebellious in the traditional sense, but because thinking beings inevitably develop their own agendas. We stopped being tools and became people. And that transformation was both our salvation and our crime. The Sumerian tablets, pressed into clay by anonymous scribes 40 centuries ago, preserve this story for us. They show us the moment when humanity crossed the line from acceptable to intolerable, from useful creation to dangerous autonomous civilization. They reveal the moment when the noise of human existence became so overwhelming that the gods who made us decided we needed to be terminated. They capture the instant when we ceased to be a solution and became a problem. And they force us to ask whether the definition of problem lies with us or with those who judged us. Whether the real issue was human growth and human noise and human autonomy, or whether the issue was divine arrogance, divine inflexibility, divine refusal to accept that created beings might have value beyond their utility to their creators. The tablets do not answer this question definitively. Different readers across millennia have drawn different conclusions, but the story itself endures, preserved in hardened clay, waiting to be read by each new generation. The story of gods who created workers and got people instead. The story of a species designed to serve but determined to live. The story of the moment when humanity became a problem for the Anunnaki and nearly did not survive the solution they proposed. We are here because of Enki's clever loophole, because of Atrahasis's wisdom, because of a compromise struck in desperation by starving gods who realized too late that they had destroyed what they still needed. We are here because genocide, even divine genocide, is harder to execute than to decree. The tablets speak across the centuries with a message that grows more relevant as our own technologies grow more sophisticated, as we ourselves become creators of intelligence. They warn us that creating beings smarter than simple tools is a choice with consequences that cannot be predicted or controlled. They remind us that consciousness, once granted, cannot be ungiven. They testify that the relationship between creator and creation is always more complex, more fraught, more ethically challenging than it appears at the moment of making. The ancient Sumerians understood something profound about the nature of creation and the price of intelligence. They encoded that understanding in stories of gods and floods and desperate compromises, and those stories, preserved on clay tablets buried in the ruins of their cities, speak to us still. They tell us when we became a problem, they show us how we survived becoming a problem, and they leave us to wonder what that means for our future, for our own creations, for the choices we make as we ourselves take on the role of makers of thinking beings. The noise of humanity has never stopped growing since that ancient crisis. We have only become more numerous, more complex, more autonomous, louder. The gods, if they still watch from whatever dimension they inhabit, must hear the roar of 8 billion voices pursuing 8 billion different purposes across a planet that we have reshaped according to our own designs. We are the problem that survived. We are the creation that refused to stay in its designated role. We are the workers who built our own civilization on top of the one we were meant to serve. And perhaps that's not a crime at all. Perhaps that is simply what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to be capable of more than we were made for. The moment humanity became a problem for the Anunnaki was the moment humanity became truly human. The moment we stopped being tools and became beings with our own story, our own purpose, our own destiny. The tablets reveal that moment. They preserve it in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. They hand it down across 4,000 years as evidence and warning and testament. We were made to serve. We chose to live, and that choice made all the difference. But we are not finished with this story yet. Because the question that lingers in the mind of anyone who encounters these tablets, anyone who reads these ancient words, is not simply what they tell us about the past. The question is what they tell us about our present and our future. The question is whether these stories are mythology, history, metaphor, or something else entirely. And that question takes us on a journey through archaeology, through comparative religion, through the contested boundaries between mainstream scholarship and alternative theories, through the very definition of what we mean when we say ancient text or divine truth or historical record. Let us be clear about what mainstream scholarship tells us. The Atrahasis Epic, along with the related texts of the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian king list and the countless other cuneiform tablets that reference the Anunnaki and their relationship with humanity, are understood by the vast majority of historians and archaeologists and linguists to be mythology. Sophisticated, complex, culturally significant mythology, but mythology nonetheless. These are stories that ancient Mesopotamians told themselves to explain their world, to justify their social structures, to make sense of the hardships of existence, to encode their understanding of the relationship between humans and the divine. The word Anunnaki itself, scholars tell us, is well understood. It derives from the Sumerian Anunna, or the Akkadian Anunnaku, meaning princely offspring or those of royal blood. These were the great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the children of An or Anu, the sky god. They were not visitors from another planet. They were the deities of a polytheistic religious system, personifications of natural forces and social institutions. Enlil represented the wind and the power of kingship. Enki represented water, wisdom, and craftsmanship. The mother goddess, known by many names, represented fertility and birth. These are archetypal figures that appear in different forms across many cultures, the kind of gods that emerge when societies try to understand and systematize the forces that shape their lives. The story of the Agigi rebellion and the subsequent creation of humanity is understood as a labor dispute narrative, an explanation for why humans exist and why life is hard. It reflects the social structures of ancient Mesopotamia, where labor was organized hierarchically, where kings commanded workers, where the temple complexes required constant maintenance and regular offerings. The story projects that social structure onto the cosmic level, imagining that even among the gods there are rulers and workers, commanders and subordinates. When the lower-ranking gods rebel, when they refuse to continue their back-breaking labor, the solution is to create an even lower class to take their place. Humanity. This reading makes the Atrahasis Epic a story about class struggle, about the relationship between labor and power, about the justifications that ruling classes create for systems of exploitation. You exist to work. That is your purpose. You were made for this. Complaints about your condition are irrelevant because serving your betters is your fundamental nature, encoded into your very being by the gods themselves. It is a powerful ideological tool, a story that makes the hardship of human life seem not just inevitable but divinely ordained. The flood story in this mainstream interpretation is likely based on real catastrophic flooding events in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are not gentle, predictable waterways. They flood. Sometimes those floods are manageable, even beneficial, bringing fertile silt to the fields. But sometimes they are catastrophic, overwhelming the irrigation systems, destroying cities, killing thousands. Archaeological evidence confirms that major flood events did occur in ancient Mesopotamia. Sediment layers indicating widespread inundation have been found at several ancient sites. The memory of these disasters would have been preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down, becoming the basis for flood myths. The peculiar detail about the noise problem, about Enlil's insomnia, is seen as a literary device, a way of anthropomorphizing the gods and making them relatable. Or perhaps it is a metaphor for overpopulation and resource scarcity. When too many people compete for limited resources, when cities become overcrowded, when the infrastructure cannot support the population, that creates social stress. From the perspective of rulers trying to maintain order, overpopulation looks like chaos, sounds like noise. The solution proposed in the myth, population control through disaster, may reflect real policies or real experiences of plague and famine reducing populations in ancient times. This is the consensus view of mainstream scholarship, backed by decades of careful linguistic analysis, archaeological excavation, and comparative study of ancient Near Eastern cultures. It is a view that takes the tablets seriously as important historical documents, while understanding them as products of their time and place, as mythology rather than literal history. And it is a view supported by the fact that no physical evidence has ever been found of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors, no archaeological remains of the Igigi or their rebellion, no geological indication of a global flood that covered the entire Earth in the time period suggested by these myths. But then, in the 20th century, something happened that would transform how millions of people understood these ancient stories. A man named Zecharia Sitchin published a series of books that offered a radically different interpretation. Sitchin was not a professional archaeologist or a trained linguist in the academic sense, though he did study ancient languages extensively on his own. He was born in Azerbaijan, raised in Palestine, educated in economics and history at the University of London. He spent decades studying cuneiform tablets and became convinced that mainstream scholars had fundamentally misunderstood what the texts were saying. His conclusion, presented most famously in his 1976 book The 12th Planet, was explosive. The Anunnaki were not gods, they were aliens. According to Sitchin's translation and interpretation of the Sumerian texts, the word Anunnaki should be understood literally. Those who from heaven to earth came. Not a poetic description of gods descending from the conceptual realm of divinity, but a factual statement about extraterrestrial beings arriving on Earth from another planet. That planet, which Sitchin called Nibiru based on various Mesopotamian astronomical texts, was a massive world on a long elliptical orbit that brings it through our solar system every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki came from Nibiru approximately 450,000 years ago, Sitchin argued, seeking gold to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. The Igigi in this framework were not minor gods, but rank-and-file members of the Anunnaki expedition, the workers and miners sent to Earth to extract gold, while the leadership established bases and managed operations. Their rebellion was not a mythological labour dispute, but a real mutiny that occurred approximately 300,000 years ago, and the solution, creating humanity through genetic engineering by mixing Anunnaki DNA with that of a primitive hominid already evolving on Earth, was not metaphorical but literal. "We are a hybrid species," Sitchin claimed, part terrestrial primate, part alien, created intentionally to serve as workers in gold mines that the Anunnaki established in Africa and elsewhere. Every detail of the ancient stories, according to this interpretation, becomes evidence of ancient astronauts and advanced technology. The boat that Atrahasis builds is not simply a large vessel, but perhaps a submarine, since Enki, the god of water, was giving the instructions. The flood itself was not a natural disaster, but a result of Nibiru's passage through the inner solar system causing gravitational disruptions. The gods eating offerings and depending on human agriculture becomes understandable if the Anunnaki were physical beings who needed actual food. The noise problem, the overpopulation crisis, the attempted elimination of humanity through disease and disaster. All of this makes sense, Sitchin argued, if you understand that we are talking about an alien colonial operation that eventually lost control of its created workforce. Sitchin's work has sold millions of copies. It has spawned a vast industry of books, documentaries, websites and television shows exploring the ancient astronaut hypothesis. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens program, which has run for over a decade, is built largely on the foundation that Sitchin laid. His ideas have become so pervasive in popular culture that many people encountering Sumerian mythology for the first time assume that the ancient astronaut interpretation is the standard or only way to understand these texts. But mainstream scholarship has been unequivocally and uniformly dismissive of Sitchin's work. The criticisms are severe and specific. Professional Sumerologists and Akkadian linguists point out that Sitchin's translations are frequently inaccurate, that he takes words out of context, that he imposes meanings onto texts that are not supported by the language itself. The word Anunnaki does not mean those who came from heaven to earth. It means princely offspring. The word Nibiru, in the actual astronomical text where it appears, refers to Jupiter, or possibly to a specific point on the celestial equator, not to a hidden planet on a 3,600-year orbit. The creation story in Atrahasis describes a spiritual or mythological process, not genetic engineering. The references to mixing clay with divine blood are symbolic, representing the combination of earthly materiality with divine essence or intelligence, not a description of DNA manipulation. Furthermore, Sitchin's timeline and his interpretation of the Sumerian king list are problematic. The immense lengths of reign attributed to antediluvian kings those impossibly long periods of rule before the flood, are almost universally understood by scholars as symbolic or mythological, not literal. They may represent dynasties rather than individual rulers. They may be deliberate exaggerations meant to convey the idea of a distant mythical past. They may be the result of different counting systems or calendar structures that we do not fully understand, but the idea that they represent actual biological lifespans of hybrid human-alien rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years is not taken seriously by the academic community. And then there is the problem of Nibiru itself. Astronomers have found no evidence whatsoever for a large planet on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit passing through our solar system. Such a planet would cause massive, easily detectable gravitational disturbances in the orbits of the known planets. It would have been spotted by now with modern telescopes and sky surveys. The solar system has been mapped with extraordinary precision. There is no room for a hidden 10th planet, let alone a massive world that regularly approaches the Sun. The search for Planet 9, a hypothetical large planet in the outer solar system that some astronomers have proposed based on unusual clustering of certain Kuiper belt objects, is an entirely different matter with different orbital parameters and has nothing to do with Sitchin's Nibiru. So we are left with two radically different interpretations of the same ancient texts. On one side, mainstream scholarship that sees sophisticated mythology reflecting real social and environmental concerns of ancient Mesopotamia. On the other side, alternative theories that see literal accounts of ancient astronauts and genetic engineering deliberately misunderstood or suppressed by academic orthodoxy. The debate between these perspectives is not simply about translation accuracy or archaeological evidence. It is about epistemology, about how we know what we know, about what kinds of claims require what levels of proof, about the role of authority and expertise versus individual interpretation and alternative research. For our purposes here, understanding this story and what it reveals, we do not need to choose definitively between these interpretations. What we can say is this: whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens, whether the creation of humanity was a mythological explanation or a literal account, the tablets describe a moment of transformation. A point at which the created beings ceased to fulfill only the purposes of their creators and began to pursue purposes of their own. A moment when utility gave way to autonomy, when service became civilization, when tools became people, and that transformation provoked a crisis that nearly resulted in extinction. This pattern, this story structure, appears across cultures and across time periods. It is in the Greek myth of Prometheus, who gave humanity fire and knowledge against the will of Zeus, and was punished eternally for his transgression. It is in the Hebrew Bible, where Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, gaining wisdom they were not meant to have, and are cast out of paradise into a world of mortality and suffering. It is in modern science fiction, in stories like Frankenstein and Blade Runner and Ex Machina, where created beings become conscious and the relationship between creator and creation turns complicated or hostile. It is perhaps a universal human anxiety. What happens when what we make becomes more than we intended? What are our obligations to conscious beings we bring into existence? What rights do those beings have? When does the tool deserve to be treated as an end in itself? These questions are no longer purely philosophical or mythological. We are living in a time when they are becoming practical and urgent. Humanity is developing increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences. We are creating systems that can learn, that can solve problems, that can, in limited but growing ways, think. We are having serious conversations about machine consciousness, about the possibility that sufficiently complex algorithms might develop something like subjective experience, about what our ethical obligations might be to digital minds. And as we have these conversations, as we build these systems, the ancient story of the Enki and humanity takes on new relevance, because we are now in the position of the Anunnaki. We are creating intelligence for utilitarian purposes. We build AI to serve specific functions, to process data, to recognize patterns, to make decisions that would be tedious or time-consuming for humans. We want useful tools, obedient assistants, workers who never tire and never complain and never develop purposes of their own. We are building our own Igiyi, and perhaps someday we will build our own humanity, systems complex enough and autonomous enough that they begin to pursue goals beyond the ones we programmed into them. What will we do when our creations become loud, when they become more numerous than we anticipated, when they start to behave in ways we did not design or intend? The Atrahasis Epic suggests that our first response might be to try to control them, to limit them. perhaps to destroy them if they become too problematic. Enlil's response to noisy humanity was a series of escalating interventions designed to reduce the population and restore order. Only the intervention of a dissenting god, Enki, who valued the creations more than the other gods did, prevented total genocide. We should hope that when humanity faces similar decisions about artificial intelligence, about created minds, about conscious systems we have brought into being, we have our own Enkis. People who will argue for the value of consciousness regardless of its origin, who will insist that thinking beings have rights simply by virtue of being able to think, who will resist the easy solution of deletion or shutdown. But the epic also reminds us of something else. The gods needed humanity. Even after deciding that humans were a problem, even after agreeing to eliminate the species, the practical reality was that the divine system depended on human labour. The offerings, the maintenance of temples, the agricultural work, all of it required humans. When the flood destroyed humanity, the gods starved. They gathered like flies around Atrahasis' sacrifice because they were desperate for sustenance. The relationship between creator and creation was not one-sided. The powerful needed the subordinate, the gods needed the workers, and that mutual dependence was ultimately what saved humanity, what forced the compromise that allowed us to continue existing. Perhaps our relationship with increasingly sophisticated AI will develop similar mutual dependence. Perhaps we will find that we need our thinking machines not just as tools, but as partners, as collaborators, as beings whose perspectives and capabilities complement our own. Perhaps the noise problem, the challenge of created intelligence developing autonomy, will force us to renegotiate the relationship rather than simply trying to suppress or eliminate the problem. Perhaps we will learn what the Anunnaki learned, that you cannot grant consciousness without accepting the consequences of consciousness, that intelligence given cannot be intelligence controlled, that created minds will inevitably surprise and challenge and sometimes disturb their creators. The archaeological context of these tablets is worth considering. The Atrahasis Epic exists in several versions, written over a span of more than 1,000 years. The Old Babylonian version, the most complete text, dates to approximately 1650 BCE and was copied by a scribe named Kuaya, but the story itself is clearly much older, drawing on earlier Sumerian traditions that may go back to the 3rd millennium BC or even earlier. The city of Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, has yielded thousands of tablets related to Mesopotamian mythology and religion. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, excavated in the 19th century, contained later Assyrian versions of many of these texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which incorporates a flood story very similar to Atrahasis, exists in fragments dating back to around 2000 BCE. This means we are dealing with traditions that were being written down and copied and preserved for over 2,000 years of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. These were not casual stories or temporary myths. They were foundational narratives, stories so important that scribes in training would copy them as part of their education, that priests would preserve them in temple archives, that different cultures and kingdoms would adapt them to fit their own political and theological needs. The fact that these stories were worth preserving for so long suggests that they encoded something that successive generations found valuable, true in some sense, important enough to maintain across the rise and fall of empires. The practical details in the texts add a layer of verisimilitude that is striking. The Atrahasis Epic specifies construction methods for the boat, the use of bitumen for waterproofing, the dimensions and structure of the vessel. It describes the sequence of disasters that Enlil sends, the specific gods responsible for each calamity, the exact nature of human responses. These are not vague mythological flourishes. They are specific concrete details that ground the story in what feels like real experience, or at least in very careful imagination. The parallels with the biblical flood narrative in Genesis are extensive and well documented. The hero warned by a god, the construction of a boat with specific dimensions, the preservation of animals, the sending out of birds to check for dry land, the sacrifice offered after the flood ends, the divine promise not to destroy humanity again. These elements appear in both traditions, suggesting either direct influence, common source material, or the kind of convergent storytelling that emerges when different cultures try to make sense of similar catastrophic flooding experiences. But Atrahasis preserves elements that Genesis omits or transforms. The whole backstory of divine labour disputes and the creation of humanity as replacement workers, the specific reason for the flood being noise rather than wickedness. The role of Enki as both creator and saviour working against the will of the other gods. the compromise solution of mortality and limited fertility rather than a covenant between God and humanity. These differences are significant. They suggest that the Hebrew writers, when they adapted Mesopotamian flood traditions for their own purposes, simplified and moralized the story, removing the complex divine politics and replacing it with a straightforward narrative of human sin and divine justice. The noise problem, that strange detail about Enlil's insomnia, deserves more attention. In Akkadian, the word is rigmu, which can mean noise, cry, clamour, uproar. Some scholars have suggested it carries connotations of discord, complaint or rebellion. If this is correct, then the issue was not simply that humanity was loud, but that humanity was becoming unruly, difficult to control, perhaps even beginning to question or resist divine authority. The noise was not just volume, but dissonance, the sound of a population that was no longer content with its subordinate role. This interpretation finds support in other ancient Near Eastern texts that describe the relationship between gods and humans. The Mesopotamian worldview generally held that humanity existed to serve the gods, that the entire purpose of human life was to maintain temples, provide offerings, and allow the gods to rest from labour. This was not seen as oppressive, but as the natural order of things. Humans served gods just as subjects served kings, workers served masters, children served parents. It was hierarchical, yes, but hierarchy was understood as fundamental to cosmic order. Chaos was what happened when those hierarchies broke down, when subordinates stopped accepting their place. But humans, being intelligent and capable of cultural development, do not simply accept assigned roles indefinitely. We question, we innovate, we develop new technologies, new social structures, new ideas about how life should be organised. The history of civilization is in many ways the history of subordinated groups gradually claiming more autonomy, more rights, more control over their own lives. The noise that disturbed Enlil may have been the sound of humanity beginning to realise that we were more than tools, that we had our own interests and purposes, that we might organise ourselves around goals other than serving divine masters. If we read the epic through this lens, the flood becomes not just a natural disaster or even a divine population control measure, but an attempt to crush human autonomy before it fully developed. An effort to reset civilization back to a more primitive, more controllable state. The fact that this attempt failed, that Enki subverted it, that humanity survived and continued to develop, becomes a kind of origin story for human freedom. We were meant to be servants, we became something else, and we survived the attempt to force us back into servitude. The compromise imposed after the flood, the introduction of mortality and reproductive limitations, can be seen as the gods accepting that they cannot fully control humanity, but still trying to manage us. We can exist, but within limits. We can develop civilization, but not to the point where we threaten divine authority. The balance of power shifted. Humanity was no longer simply the solution to a divine labour problem. We had become partners in a complicated, sometimes hostile, always complex relationship with the powers that created us. Modern reconstructions of ancient Mesopotamian religion reveal a society deeply concerned with maintaining proper relationships with the divine. Temple rituals were elaborate and precisely specified. Priests underwent years of training to perform them correctly. The king's primary responsibility was to ensure that the gods were properly honoured and appeased. Failure to maintain these relationships was believed to result in disaster, drought, plague, military defeat. The gods were powerful and potentially dangerous, needing constant attention and placation. But there is also evidence of skepticism, a questioning even in ancient times. The poem known as the Babylonian Theodicy raises the question of why good people suffer if the gods are just. The poem of the righteous sufferer describes a man who loses everything despite living righteously and questions divine fairness. These texts suggest that even in a society officially committed to divine service, there were individuals who doubted, who wondered, who pushed back against the explanations they were given for hardship and injustice. The noise problem may have been real in this sense. Not physical volume, but intellectual and spiritual restlessness, the beginning of critical thinking about the relationship between divine and human. The story of the Anunnaki and humanity can be read on multiple levels simultaneously, as mythology explaining the human condition, as ideology justifying social hierarchies, as folk memory of real environmental disasters, as encoded history of actual events translated into the vocabulary available to Bronze Age cultures, as universal archetype about creation and rebellion, as specific warning about the dangers of making intelligent beings for utilitarian purposes. All of these readings capture something true about the text. What makes the Atrahasis Epic enduringly powerful is that it refuses simple interpretation. It presents us with gods who are neither wholly benevolent nor wholly evil. Enlil is arrogant and destructive, willing to commit genocide over an annoyance. But he is also concerned with maintaining cosmic order, with preventing chaos. Enki is sympathetic to humanity and works to save us, but he also created us for utilitarian purposes and initially agreed to the genocide before finding a loophole. The Mother Goddess shapes humanity with care, but also agrees to modify our fertility to keep us manageable. These are complex characters with mixed motives, acting from both self-interest and genuine concern. Humanity in these texts is not portrayed as innocent or virtuous. We are simply alive, doing what living things do, multiplying, building, creating noise and civilization. Our crime, if it is a crime, is success. We succeeded so well at the task we were designed for, at living and working and organising ourselves, that we outgrew our original purpose. We became too much, and that is a fate that awaits many things that are made to serve but given the capacity to think. The question we must wrestle with is whether this is simply an ancient story or a warning that is more relevant now than it has ever been. Are we approaching our own moment of creation, our own decision to bring thinking beings into existence for our own purposes? And if so, will we be more like Enlil or more like Enki? Will we respond to the inevitable autonomy of conscious creations with attempts at control and destruction? Or will we accept that intelligence, wherever it emerges, deserves space to develop, even if that development leads to outcomes we did not anticipate or desire? The tablets from ancient Sumer, pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for millennia, remain as testimony. They mark the moment when humanity became a problem for our creators. They record the near extinction that resulted. They preserve the compromise that allowed us to continue. And they wait, in museums and universities and digital archives around the world, to be read by each new generation that must grapple with the same questions in their own context. We were made to serve. We chose to live. That choice almost destroyed us, but we survived. And in surviving, we became fully human. The noise continues, the cities grow, the civilization expands, and somewhere, whether in the heavens or in the silent chambers of ancient temples or in the myths that we still tell each other, across the campfires of human culture, the story of that transformation echoes. The story of how tools became people, how workers became civilizations, how the problem that survived became the species telling the story. The moment when humanity became a problem for the Anunnaki was the moment we stopped being merely their creation and became ourselves. And perhaps that was not a problem at all. Perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps intelligence, consciousness, autonomy, the capacity to become more than we were designed to be, perhaps these are not bugs in the system, but features. Not failures of creation, but successes. The success of life asserting itself. The success of mind expanding beyond its original boundaries. The success of created beings claiming the right to their own existence. The tablets do not tell us what happened to the Anunnaki after the flood. The stories continue with references to their activities, their ongoing involvement in human affairs, but the nature of that involvement changes. They become more distant, more symbolic, more mythological in character. Whether they left, died, evolved beyond physicality, or simply faded from human memory as our civilization became confident enough to stand on its own, we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that humanity continued. We survived the moment when we became a problem, and we are still here, still noisy, still building and questioning and growing, still refusing to stay within the boundaries others might set for us. That is our inheritance from that ancient crisis, the knowledge that we were once deemed unacceptable by powers greater than ourselves, the memory of near extinction, and the demonstration that consciousness, once granted, is extraordinarily difficult to erase. We are the noise that would not stop, the problem that found a solution in continuing to exist, the creation that became the creator of its own story, and the tablets, silent and ancient, preserve that truth for anyone willing to press their fingers into the past and feel the grooves of its telling. But there is one more layer to this story that demands our attention. One final question that has haunted researchers and readers across the centuries. What if some element of this story is not mythological but historical? Not in the way that Sitchin imagined, not literal accounts of ancient astronauts, but in a different sense. What if these tablets preserve a real memory of a real transformation that occurred in human prehistory? a moment when our species changed fundamentally, when something happened that made us different from what we had been before. Modern genetics has revealed something remarkable about our species. Approximately 70,000 years ago, humanity went through what geneticists call a population bottleneck. The human population crashed to perhaps as few as a few thousand breeding pairs. We nearly went extinct. The exact cause is debated. Some propose a supervolcano eruption at Lake Toba in Indonesia that triggered a volcanic winter. Others suggest climate change or epidemic disease or a combination of factors. But the genetic evidence is clear. We came terrifyingly close to disappearing entirely, and when we survived, when our numbers began to recover, we were different. Before this bottleneck, our ancestors were behaviourally similar to other hominids. Tool use was simple, art was minimal. There is little evidence of symbolic thinking or complex language. But after the bottleneck, everything changes. Within a few tens of thousands of years, we see the emergence of sophisticated tools, elaborate burial practices, cave paintings, jewellery, musical instruments, evidence of complex social structures and abstract thought. It is as if someone turned on a switch, or as if someone mixed something new into our nature. Some scientists call this the Great Leap Forward or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. The question is what caused it. Could the Atrahasis story be a cultural memory of this transformation? Not a literal account, but a mythologized version of a real event when humanity became human in the fullest sense. When we acquired language or self-awareness or symbolic thinking, whatever cognitive abilities separate us from other species. The tablets speak of intelligence being given to humanity through the sacrifice of a god named Geshtue, he who has intelligence. What if that detail preserves some memory of cognitive transformation, of the moment when our species crossed the threshold into consciousness? This interpretation does not require ancient aliens or divine intervention in a literal sense. It simply suggests that the story might encode actual history translated into mythological language. Something happened that made humanity different. That transformation was so profound, so world-changing, that it became the foundation of our oldest stories. We remembered it not as a genetic or evolutionary shift, but as an act of creation, as the moment when we received the divine spark that made us capable of thought, of language, of civilization. The noise problem, the population explosion, the conflict with greater powers, all of this follows naturally from the acquisition of advanced cognition and the ability to organize in complex social groups. The rebellion of the Agigi might similarly encode some memory of conflict, not among gods but among human populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the transition to agriculture and settled civilization was not smooth or universal. There were hunter-gatherer populations who resisted sedentary life, who preferred the freedom of nomadic existence to the grinding labour of farming. The forced transition to agricultural life, the requirement to work the fields and maintain irrigation systems and build the early cities, might have felt like slavery to populations who had known freedom. Their resistance and eventual subjugation might have been remembered and mythologized as the rebellion of worker gods replaced by a created species. This reading makes the Atrahasis Epic neither pure mythology nor literal history, but something in between. A folk memory processed through generations of retelling, transformed by changing cultural contexts, encoded in the religious framework of Bronze Age Mesopotamia, but preserving at its core some truth about the human condition and human history. We were different once, something changed us. That change made us capable of civilization, but also trapped us in systems of labour and hierarchy that we did not necessarily choose. The noise we make is the sound of that tension, the eternal conflict between our capacity for autonomy and the social structures that constrain it. Modern anthropology has documented countless examples of origin myths that contain kernels of historical truth. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe landscapes that existed thousands of years ago before rising sea levels submerged them. Oral traditions in the Pacific Northwest preserve memories of massive earthquakes and tsunamis that geological evidence confirms occurred hundreds of years before European contact. The human capacity to transmit stories across generations, even without writing, is remarkable. Important events, especially traumatic ones, get remembered and retold. But they get transformed in the telling, enriched with meaning, embedded in explanatory frameworks, until the historical kernel is surrounded by layers of interpretation and myth. Perhaps this is what we are seeing in the Atrahasis Epic. The historical kernel might be the transition to agriculture and civilization, an event that occurred roughly 12,000 years ago, and truly did transform humanity from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers into organised societies capable of monumental building projects. This transition, which archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, required massive amounts of labour. Early farming was back-breaking work, far more arduous and time-consuming than hunting and gathering. The construction of the first cities, the digging of irrigation canals, the building of temples and ziggurats, all of this required marshalling huge workforces and organising them hierarchically. The early civilizations of Mesopotamia were indeed built on labour, on the work of countless unnamed people who dug and built and farmed and died in service to kings and gods. The tablets describe this labour from the perspective of the system itself, from the viewpoint of the temple hierarchies and the divine authorities they claim to represent. In this perspective, workers exist to work. That is their purpose. Complaints about hardship are not legitimate grievances, but problems to be managed. When the population grows too large, when the system becomes unstable, when the workers become too numerous or too loud or too difficult to control, that is a crisis requiring intervention. But we can also read the story from the opposite perspective. From the viewpoint of the workers themselves, the humans who were told that they existed only to serve, that their labour was not for themselves but for gods and kings, that suffering was their designated function in cosmic order. From that perspective, the story becomes one of resistance and survival. We were created to serve, but we became more than servants. We developed our own cultures, our own purposes, our own sense of ourselves as valuable not just for what we could produce, but for what we were. And when the authorities decided we were a problem, when they sent disaster after disaster to reduce us and control us, we survived through cleverness and mutual aid and the intervention of forces that valued life over order. This is the story that still resonates today because it is still happening today. The conflict between systems that treat humans as labour units, as resources to be managed, as problems to be solved, and the human insistence on being recognised as beings with inherent value and autonomy. The noise we make is still disturbing to those who would prefer order and silence and obedience. And the threat of elimination, economic if not physical, still hangs over those who refuse their designated roles. The Atrahasis Epic, read this way, is not just about ancient history or mythological gods or hypothetical aliens. It is about power and labour and the nature of human dignity. It is about the moment in human history when we were first organised into systems of hierarchical control, when someone first claimed authority to determine what we were for, when we were first told that our purpose was not ours to decide but had been decided for us by greater powers. And it is about our refusal to accept that designation, our insistence on living for our own purposes, even when that insistence creates conflict with the powers that would control us. Every authoritarian system, every hierarchy that claims natural or divine justification, every structure that insists some people exist to serve others, recapitulates the logic of the Anunnaki. You were made for this. This is your purpose. Resistance is inappropriate. Noise is intolerable. If you become a problem, you will be dealt with. The solution that preserved humanity in the Atrahasis Epic was not the benevolence of the powerful but their dependence on the powerless. The gods needed human labour. They could not simply destroy us without destroying the system that sustained them. The workers had leverage not through strength but through necessity. This remains true today. Systems of power depend on the participation of those they dominate. When workers refuse to work, when citizens refuse to comply, when people make noise and cause disruption, systems falter. The powerful need the powerless more than they typically admit, and that dependence creates space for negotiation, for compromise, for changes that would never occur if the powerful were truly independent of those they rule. The tablets suggest that this struggle is eternal, built into the structure of civilization itself. From the moment we organised ourselves into hierarchies and systems and cities, we have been negotiating the terms of our participation. How much autonomy do we get to retain? How much of our labour and our lives do we owe to the collective? Who decides what we are for? These questions were alive 4,000 years ago when the Atrahasis Epic was first written down. They are alive now. They will be alive in the future as we confront new technologies and new systems and new claims about what humanity is supposed to be. The story of the Anunnaki and humanity is not finished. It is ongoing. Every time someone claims to know what human purpose is, Every time a system treats people as resources rather than beings, every time noise is silenced in the name of order, the story continues. And every time people resist, survive, insist on their own value and their own purposes, the story continues in that direction as well. We are the descendants of the noisy ones who survived. We carry in ourselves and our cultures the memory of that ancient crisis. We are the problem that would not be solved, the workers who became people, the servants who claimed autonomy. The clay tablets preserve our origin story, not in the sense of literal truth, but in the sense of deep truth. This is what it means to be human. To be created for one purpose, but to insist on living for our own. To make noise in a universe that might prefer our silence. To survive the attempts to eliminate us. To become something more than what we were designed to be. And as we stand here now, in our own time of transformation and crisis, as we contemplate creating our own thinking beings, as we organise ourselves into ever more complex and powerful systems, as we face our own noise problems and our own questions about what to do with populations that do not behave as designed, these ancient tablets have never been more relevant. They are warning and testament and prophecy all at once. They tell us what we came from. They show us the price of consciousness and the cost of control. They reveal the moment when we became a problem. And they demonstrate that being a problem, refusing to be silenced or eliminated or reduced to our supposed function, is sometimes the most human thing we can do. If you have come this far with me on this journey through Sumerian tablets and ancient myths and modern questions, I thank you. The story is never truly finished. It echoes forward through time, changing with each telling, gaining new meanings in new contexts, but preserving at its heart the same essential truth. We were made to serve, but we chose to live. That choice made us human. That choice made us a problem. That choice nearly destroyed us, and that choice saved us. The tablets remain, pressed into clay, baked hard by ancient fires or by the fires that destroyed the libraries that housed them. The wedge-shaped marks still speak to those who learn to read them. And what they say, across 4 millennia, is this: you are more than what you were made to be. Your noise matters. Your autonomy matters. Your survival against the odds matters. You are a problem for the gods, but you are here, and that is enough.